New York City, November 11th, 1968. Carnegie Hall was sold out. Every seat, standing room only in the back. Outside on 57th Street, people who hadn't been able to get tickets stood in the cold, listening for anything that might seep through the walls. It was a benefit concert, children's charities, the kind of event that brought out the best names in the business, not because the money was good, because there was no money, but because the cause was real and because Frank Sinatra had asked. When Frank Sinatra asked, people came. Audrey Hepburn was not supposed to sing that night. She was supposed to introduce the second half of the program, say a few warm words, present Frank for his closing set. That was all. That was the arrangement. That was what her manager had agreed to, what the program printed, what everyone expected. What happened instead is the story nobody who was there has ever been able to fully explain. Not the facts of it, the facts are simple enough, but the feeling, the particular quality of what filled that hall for 4 minutes and 20 seconds, and what it did to the people inside it, and what it did to Frank. To understand the dare, you have to understand the friendship, and to understand the friendship, you have to understand that it shouldn't have worked at all. Frank Sinatra and Audrey Hepburn were by most measures opposites. Frank was loud where Audrey was quiet. Frank was combustible where Audrey was controlled. Frank filled every room he entered. Audrey somehow made every room feel quieter, more concentrated. Frank's relationships were operatic. The feuds, the reconciliations, the loyalty oaths, the spectacular fallouts. Audrey's were precise and few, and kept with the care of someone who understood that real friendship is a limited and precious resource. They had met in the early 1950s, in the overlapping social world of Hollywood, where everyone knew everyone, and most of those knowings were superficial. Their first real conversation, by Frank's own account, told to a journalist years later, had been at a party in 1954, a crowded, loud affair in Beverly Hills that both of them had attended reluctantly and were both looking for an excuse to leave. They had ended up on the same terrace, avoiding the same noise. Frank had offered her a cigarette. She had declined. She didn't smoke. He had told her she was in the wrong business. She had laughed. They had stood there for an hour, talking about nothing and everything, two people who had arrived at the same place from completely different directions and were surprised to find each other there. What Frank recognized in Audrey, he would say later, was honesty, not the performed kind, the kind that cost something. He had been in a business that ran on flattery and performance for long enough that genuine directness felt almost shocking when he encountered it. Audrey said what she thought, not carelessly, she was too careful for carelessness, but truthfully. She disagreed with him about things. She didn't adjust her opinions to match his mood. She treated him like a person who could handle the truth, which was both unusual and, he found, completely necessary. Audrey recognized in Frank something that surprised her. Underneath the legend, underneath Sinatra, the voice, the chairman of the board, all the enormous accumulated weight of the public persona, there was a man who was genuinely deeply uncertain, not about his talent, about everything else, about whether he was loved or merely admired, about whether the warmth in rooms when he entered was for him or for what he represented, about whether any of it, in the end, meant what it was supposed to mean. She understood that uncertainty from the inside. She carried the same one, so they became, quietly and without fanfare, friends. Not the kind of friends who were seen together often or who made the columns, the private kind, the phone call kind, the kind who showed up when something actually mattered. By 1968, they had known each other for 14 years. Audrey was 39. Frank was 52. Both of them had been through versions of their lives that the public had seen and versions that nobody had seen. Audrey had been through her first marriage, her second, the miscarriages, the years of making extraordinary pictures while quietly grieving everything the pictures couldn't give her. Frank had been through Ava Gardner and the years when the voice nearly left him and the long climb back, and Mia Farrow and the weight of being Frank Sinatra in a decade that wasn't sure what to do with Frank Sinatra. The world was changing. 1968 was a year that was changing everything. Assassinations, protests, the particular feeling that the ground had shifted and nobody was certain what was underneath it anymore. The cool elegance that Frank and Audrey represented, the world they had both been made in, felt suddenly and irrevocably past tense. Neither of them talked about that directly, but both of them felt it. The Carnegie Hall benefit had been Frank's idea. He had organized it in 6 weeks, called in every favor, pulled together a lineup that included Tony Bennett, Ella Fitzgerald, and a dozen others. He had asked Audrey to participate, not because she was a singer. She wasn't, not professionally, not seriously, but because her name on the program meant something, because her presence raised the profile of the event, because she was his friend and he wanted her there. She had agreed on the condition that she wouldn't be asked to perform. Frank had agreed to that condition. Absolutely, of course, she would introduce, nothing more. He had agreed with the particular quality of agreement that means I'm going to revisit this later. The first half of the concert went exactly as planned. Tony Bennett opened. Ella performed 4 songs that made people feel things they hadn't known they were carrying. The audience was generous and warm and full of the particular electricity that comes from a room full of people who know they're watching something real. Audrey was backstage for most of it. She had arrived early, the way she always did, and spent the hours before the show in the way she always spent waiting time, reading, mostly, and drinking tea, and talking quietly with whoever happened to be nearby. She was calm. She was prepared for what she had agreed to do. A short introduction, Frank's name, exit. Frank found her backstage during the intermission. He was in his element, charged, bright-eyed, the version of himself that performing brought out, the most alive version, the version that the stage had created and continued to sustain. He sat down next to her, too close, the way Frank sat when he wanted to make something happen. She looked at him. He had a look on his face she recognized. She had seen it before. The look of a man with an idea he has already decided to execute. She said, "No." He hadn't said anything yet. She said, "Whatever it is, Frank." "No." He told her anyway. He wanted her to sing. One song. No rehearsal, no arrangement. The orchestra would follow her wherever she went. She could choose the song. She could choose the key. He just wanted her to sing. She told him she wasn't a singer. He told her that wasn't what he'd asked. She told him the audience had paid to hear professionals. He told her the audience had paid to feel something real, and that she was the realest person he knew, and that real was more valuable than professional. She told him she would be terrible. He said, "So what?" Being terrible in front of 3,000 people at Carnegie Hall is something most people never get to do. At least it would be interesting. She told him she hadn't sung in public since she was a child, since before the war. Frank went quiet. He knew about the war. He knew what she meant by that. The Netherlands, the occupation, the hunger, the years in which everything including music had become part of survival or had simply stopped. She had told him once, late in a long conversation, about singing as a child, how her mother had encouraged it, how she had sung in school performances, in church, in the small domestic ways that children sing before the world has opinions about it, and how all of that had been interrupted, covered over, made to feel like something that belonged to a person she no longer was. Frank said, "Maybe that's why." She looked at him. "Maybe that's exactly why you should do it," he said, "because it was a child who loved it and a child who lost it, and you've been carrying it ever since. And maybe it's time to put it down somewhere where people can hear it." Audrey said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "If I do this and it's awful, you owe me dinner at the best restaurant in New York City." Frank said, "Deal. And if it's not awful, you owe me nothing, because the look on your face when you realize it's not awful will be payment enough." She chose the song in the car on the way to the dressing room. She didn't deliberate long. The song was already there, waiting. It had always been there. The second half opened with 2 more performances. The audience was settled now, happy, generous with their applause. Everything was going well. Then Frank walked onto the stage to introduce the intermission speaker. He did it warmly, with the ease of a man who has spent 5 decades being comfortable in front of crowds. He said a few words about the charity, about why the night mattered, about the children who would benefit. Then he paused. He said, "Before our final speaker comes out, I want to do something that isn't on the program. I want to introduce someone who is going to sing for you tonight. She is not a professional singer. She told me that herself, and I told her I didn't care, and she told me I was impossible, and I told her that was accurate and irrelevant. She is going to sing one song without rehearsal, with our orchestra following wherever she leads. And I want you to receive it the way it deserves to be received, not as a performance but as a gift." He looked toward the wings. "Ladies and gentlemen, my friend, Audrey Hepburn." The applause started before she reached the microphone. Not the roar that would have greeted a headline act. Something different, warmer, more uncertain. 3,000 people trying to understand what they were about to witness. Audrey walked to the center of the stage. She wore a simple dark dress, no elaborate staging, no dramatic entrance. She walked the way she walked everywhere, with that quality of movement that people always noticed, that combination of grace and absolute unself-consciousness that made it impossible to look away from her. She reached the microphone. She looked at the orchestra conductor. He looked at her. She said the song. She said the key. He nodded. She looked at the audience. She said, "I'm terrified. I want you to know that. Frank told me that was a good sign. Frank tells me a lot of things." 3,000 people laughed. The tension in the room shifted. Not gone, but changed into something warmer. She said, "This is a song I learned when I was very young, before everything changed. I haven't sung it in public since I was a child, so if it's not quite right, please be kind." She nodded to the conductor. The song was Moon River. Not the version the world knew, something slower, more interior. Just her voice and the orchestra, barely beneath it, following wherever she led. The first note was not polished. It was not the note of a trained singer hitting a mark. It was the note of a person beginning something they have carried for a very long time and are finally setting down. Her voice was small by professional standards. It didn't fill the hall the way a trained voice fills a hall. It didn't need to, because the hall filled itself with the quality of attention that only happens when something genuinely unguarded is happening on a stage. 3,000 people leaning forward, 3,000 people holding something in. She wasn't performing the song, she was remembering it. There's a difference that you can hear, and 3,000 people heard it. Her voice caught, somewhere in the middle, a tremor that lasted less than a second, that she moved through without stopping. Most singers would have been trained to hide it. She had no such training, and even if she had, something in the moment wouldn't have allowed it. Frank was standing in the wings, stage left, arms crossed, the way he stood when paying close attention. His face was doing something that the 2 or 3 people near him would describe afterward in almost identical terms, the face of a man watching something that was getting past his defenses. She had found, in the middle of the song, something she hadn't expected to find, the child who had loved music before the war, the girl who had sung in churches in the Netherlands before occupation, made singing feel like something from another life. That girl was not gone. She had simply been waiting, in the way that the parts of ourselves we lose don't disappear, but stay somewhere interior, patient, until someone or something calls them back. Her eyes were wet, not crying, not quite, the eyes of someone feeling something fully and choosing not to look away. Frank uncrossed his arms. His face had changed completely. The man who was always in control of his face, who had spent 5 decades managing the expression he gave to rooms and cameras and the world, that control was gone. Something had come undone. She held the final note. Not long, just long enough to mean it. The hall was silent. Not the silence before applause, something different. The silence of a room that has received something it wasn't expecting and doesn't yet know what to do with it. Then someone in the 3rd row started to clap. Then the row, then the hall, then everyone, 3,000 people on their feet, applauding not with the excitement of a great performance, but with something more like gratitude, the way you applaud when someone has shown you something true. Audrey stood at the microphone. She looked slightly surprised, not false modesty, genuine surprise, the expression of someone who had expected the worst and received something entirely different. She looked toward the wings, toward Frank. Frank walked onto the stage. He was not composed. That was the first thing people saw. Frank Sinatra, who was always composed, who had performed through personal catastrophes and professional humiliations and decades of scrutiny without ever losing the surface, walking onto that stage undone, not dramatically, not theatrically, just genuinely moved, in the way that bypasses all the mechanisms a person has for keeping genuinely moved from showing on their face. He walked to Audrey. He put his arms around her. He held on. The applause, which had started to settle, surged again. They stood there, center stage at Carnegie Hall, Frank holding on to Audrey while 3,000 people watched, and it was one of those moments that becomes a monument, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. When he finally pulled back, he turned to the microphone. His voice was rough. He didn't try to make it smooth. He said, "I've been singing for 40 years. I know what it sounds like when somebody means it." He stopped, cleared his throat. "That's what it sounds like." He walked her to the wings. The rest of the evening belonged to him, his closing set. the songs the audience had come for, the performances that the reviews would praise the next morning. He sang beautifully, the way he always sang, but the people who were there would say, in the years afterward, that the part they remembered was not Frank. It was 4 minutes and 20 seconds of Moon River, and the look on Frank Sinatra's face when it was over. Backstage later, after the crowd had gone and the stagehands were breaking down and the particular exhaustion of a long night was settling over everyone, Audrey found Frank in the corridor outside his dressing room. She said, "You owe me dinner." He said, "The hell I do." "That was not awful." She said, "It was not professional." He said, "I told you, professional and real are different things. You were real. I don't owe you dinner. You owe me an apology for arguing with me about this." She told him she was not going to apologize. He told her he hadn't expected her to. They stood in the corridor and she looked at him, at the face that was still not quite back to its usual composure, at the evidence of what he had felt while standing in those wings, and she said, "What happened out there, Frank?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I don't know exactly. Something about hearing you sing it the way you sang it, like you were singing it for the first time, like it was new. I've heard that song 1,000 times. I've sung that song, but I've never heard it like that." She waited. He said, "I think I've been singing it from the outside for so long I forgot what it feels like from the inside. And you walked out there with no preparation and no protection, and you sang it from the inside, and it reminded me." "Reminded you of what?" she said. He thought about it. "Why I started," he said, "before all the rest of it, before the chairman of the board and the Rat Pack and the whole machine of it. Before I became Frank Sinatra, there was just a kid from Hoboken who heard music and felt like it was the only thing that made sense. You sounded like that tonight. Like music was the only thing that made sense." He looked at her. "I forgot that kid," he said. "I've been so busy being Sinatra that I forgot Frankie, and you brought him back for a minute. In front of 3,000 people, while I was standing in the wings like an idiot with my arms crossed, you brought him back." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I think that's the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me after they called me terrified and dared me in front of a concert audience." He laughed. First laugh of the night that wasn't for anyone else. He said, "How about that dinner anyway?" She said, "Absolutely." Audrey Hepburn never sang in public again after that night. She was asked, occasionally, in the years that followed, for charity events, for tributes, for projects that wanted the association of her name with music. She always declined, politely, warmly, without explanation. Only once did she explain. In a conversation with a friend years later, she said, "I sang that song on that stage for that reason, on that night, and it was complete. It didn't need to happen again." Frank kept the memory of it differently. He mentioned it in interviews on 3 separate occasions over the following decade, not at length, not dramatically, but as a reference point. When asked about what he admired in other artists, when asked about authenticity, when asked about what music was for, he always said the same thing. He said, "There was a night at Carnegie Hall. Audrey Hepburn sang Moon River without rehearsal in front of 3,000 people. She wasn't a professional singer, she was just honest. And honest, it turns out, is everything. Technique is what you do when you don't trust the truth." She trusted the truth. That's the whole lesson. He never said it was him who dared her. That detail he kept it the way you keep things that belong to you, to the private story, to the friendship rather than the legend. Frank Sinatra died in May of 1998. Audrey had been gone 5 years already. At his memorial, they played recordings, the great ones, the songs that would last forever. But Barbara Sinatra, in her private remarks to the family, mentioned something that wasn't on the program. She said Frank had a recording, an unofficial one, an audience tape, the kind made without permission on a small device from somewhere in the 3rd row. 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The sound quality was not good. You could hear the room around it. She said he listened to it sometimes alone in the evenings. She said he kept it in the same place he kept the things that mattered most.